Did you ever get any money from Costello?
No.
And did you ever get any money from Myelansky?
I never got money from any of those fellas. None of those fellas. None of these that I've been reading about, and none that I knew. They never gave me anything.
None of the Shetties?
No. I don't even speak to them. I mean, I met that Charlie once or twice. I don't even talk to him.
You don't like him?
No.
She was the woman who made the Mafia rich, the FBI furious, and Hollywood obsessed. A southern girl with a voice like whiskey and a mind built for war, she bedded kings of crime, outsmarted the government, and vanished with secrets no man could afford to keep. They called her a courtesan, a spy, a thief, a witch in silk stockings. But to those who really knew her, she was something worse. She was independent. This is the story the mob tried to erase, the FBI failed to decode, and Hollywood only dared to imitate. The rise and fall of Virginia Hill, the woman who knew too much and told nothing. March 24th, 1966. Koppel, Austria. A farmer found the car just after dawn. A small Volkswagen parked neatly off the road, its windows glazed with frost. Inside sat a woman perfectly still, her head resting on the wheel. The police found a bottle of pills and a note that read, "I am tired of life." Her name was Virginia Hill Hauser, once the highest paid woman in organized crime, lover of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the courier who carried millions for the Chicago outfit and the New York syndicates. They called it suicide. But there were no footprints in the snow, the dosage didn't match. And within 48 hours, American officials arrived from Vienna to seize her belongings, including a small black notebook written in English. It was never seen again. The case was closed in 6 days. For the men she once worked beside, her death solved more problems than it raised. To the mob, she was the woman who knew too much. To the government, she was the witness they'd never want to testify. And to history, she became a mystery that began long before Austria, in the heat of Alabama, where a poor girl decided she'd rather be feared than forgotten. Virginia Hill's story doesn't begin with fame or fortune. It begins in the steel dust of Lipscomb, Alabama, a mining town built on exhaustion. She was born in 1916, one of 10 children in a house where violence was routine and food was a privilege. Her father, a mill worker named Mac Hill, drank heavily and hit often. Her mother, Margaret, endured it until she couldn't anymore. When Virginia was 9, she took the children she could and fled to Georgia. They arrived in Marietta with nothing. The South had no mercy for single mothers. The family survived on odd jobs and reputation, and Virginia grew up hearing whispers about her mother's disgrace. It didn't make her ashamed, it made her defiant. She learned young that survival wasn't about being good. It was about being clever. By 14, she'd figured out that rules were written by people who already had power. She had none. But she had beauty, a fast tongue, and an instinct for control. She turned heads in a town that preferred women silent. When people called her wild, she took it as confirmation she was impossible to own. She left school after 8th grade. Work was all that mattered. She waited tables, swept floors, and counted change faster than anyone else in town. Every dollar went into a tin she kept hidden under her bed, her escape fund. When the Chicago World's Fair was announced in 1933, it felt like a sign. A century of progress, they called it. She bought a one-way ticket north and boarded a train out of Georgia. She was 17, alone, and determined never to come back. Chicago was a different universe. The city was crawling with power, gangsters, fixers, and politicians who'd survived prohibition by learning that vice was more profitable when it looked legitimate. Al Capone had just gone to prison, but his organization lived on under Frank Nitti, Murray the Camel Humphreys, and Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik. Gambling, extortion, and racketeering were no longer crimes. They were systems. Virginia rented a room near the fairgrounds and got a job in a cafe frequented by racing men and bookmakers. She poured coffee for gangsters in suits who read the racing sheets like holy scripture. She noticed the hierarchy immediately: the collectors who bragged, the enforcers who watched, and the quiet ones who paid for everyone's meal. It was one of those quiet men who changed her life. His name was Joseph Joe Epstein. He was 33 years old, polite, reserved, and always impeccably dressed. Epstein wasn't a hitman or a thug. He was an accountant. He worked directly under Guzik, managing the outfit's racetrack bets, wire room operations, and cash flow from Chicago to Cicero. In an organization built on fear, Epstein's weapon was arithmetic. He noticed the red-haired waitress who never forgot a face and never lingered on a conversation. He tested her. He dropped a fake betting slip on the counter. She returned it without comment. The next day, he asked her if she could count money. She said yes. Then he asked if she could keep her mouth shut. Her answer: "I've been doing that my whole life." Within a week, she was working for him. No paperwork, no questions. She became a runner, delivering envelopes from the betting parlors to the central offices. She used public transport, carried no weapon, and smiled at policemen when they tipped their hats. No one suspected the girl carrying thousands of dollars in her purse. Epstein quickly realized she was more than a courier. She understood the movement of money, where it came from, how it disappeared, and why certain figures never added up. She asked smart questions, never emotional ones. He began teaching her the mechanics of organized finance, the wire systems that transmitted bets, the shell companies used to launder cash, and the float money that never appeared on paper. Under Epstein's guidance, Hill became fluent in the silent language of corruption. She learned how Chicago's gambling profits moved through nightclubs, restaurants, and clean investment fronts. The outfit controlled every link: the bookmakers, the cashiers, the accountants, even the local politicians who guaranteed that raids happened only on schedule. Her efficiency made her indispensable. She delivered money precisely, never took more than her cut, and knew which police stations could be paid to lose evidence. By 19, she was Epstein's most trusted runner. The outfit called her Flame. Red hair, fast mind, no fear. She began earning real money. Dresses from Marshall Fields, shoes from Saks, rent paid in cash. She sent part of her pay home to Georgia and spent the rest blending into a class she'd once only seen in magazines. She was no longer a runaway. She was an operator. Epstein expanded her responsibilities. She started managing transfers, moving profits between Chicago and the West Coast operations run by Mickey Cohen and Jack Dragner. She learned to use code words on the phone, to switch aliases when wiring funds, and to record everything in shorthand. Her private notes were meticulous: initials, dates, color-coded arrows. Red for dirty cash, green for clean. It was the same system she would keep all her life. By 1938, the outfit decided to expand officially into California. Los Angeles had become a gambler's paradise. Movie stars, producers, and studio executives who loved betting but couldn't afford scandal. The Chicago bosses wanted control. They needed someone who could move among them without suspicion. Joe Epstein nominated her. He arranged her transfer personally. She would continue to work under the outfit's financial umbrella, reporting directly to him. Her assignment: handle racetrack profits, open new channels for bookmaking, and develop contacts among Hollywood's elite. Her cover was simple: a socialite with money and impeccable taste. She arrived in Los Angeles that summer. Epstein sent introductions ahead of her, letters to Mickey Cohen, the West Coast enforcer for the outfit, and to several Hollywood investors, whose names appeared on both studio payrolls and gambling ledgers. Within weeks, she was in the center of a new empire, one that blurred the line between crime and celebrity. Virginia had become what the FBI would later describe as an independent operative of high value, capable of navigating both criminal and legitimate financial systems. Epstein had built her into the perfect liaison, a woman who could walk into a producer's office, discuss a film budget, and leave with a suitcase full of untaxed cash. When Virginia Hill began working for Joe Epstein, she stopped being a courier and started becoming something far more dangerous, a woman who understood the internal logic of the Chicago outfit. Epstein's office was in a legitimate business building on South Wabash Avenue, several floors above a bank that unknowingly processed millions in mob money every year. To outsiders, he was a businessman. In reality, he controlled the cash flow of an empire that stretched from the racetracks of Illinois to the casinos of Havana. Epstein didn't trust many people, but Hill had proven herself useful, disciplined, and immune to fear. Her new role was part assistant, part apprentice. Epstein had her transcribe coded ledgers and balance the wire books, the telephone betting system that connected racetracks across the country. She learned to convert street cash into checks, checks into deposits, and deposits into clean investments. The system depended on precision. A single mistake could draw attention from the Treasury Department, or worse, from Frank Nitty's auditors. Hill never made mistakes. By 1936, she had full access to the outfit's Western accounts, the funds that handled profits from bookmakers in Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Phoenix. She was the courier who could explain every number she carried. It was unheard of in a world that considered women replaceable. Epstein began trusting her with more sensitive work. She was sent to meet with Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, Capone's former treasurer, to collect lists of politicians on the outfit's payroll. She delivered payments to Murray the Camel Humphreys, who handled labor unions, and learned how insurance was sold to businesses through threats that never had to be spoken aloud. In later FBI reports, agents would write that Hill was one of the few females in the country with first-hand knowledge of the organization's political contacts and monetary structure. She wasn't a secretary, she was an insider. Her education under Epstein was cold and methodical. She learned how to layer cash, moving it through 3 or 4 businesses to obscure its origin. She learned which banks ignored suspicious transactions, which accountants would doctor figures, and which politicians to invite to dinner when audits appeared. Epstein's motto was simple: paper is power. If you know where the money goes, you control everyone who touches it. Hill listened. She began keeping her own version of the books, not for betrayal, but for protection. Her notebook contained initials, locations, and sums recorded in color-coded ink. Epstein knew she was writing things down. He didn't stop her. It meant she had a stake in staying quiet. By 1937, Hill was handling more than errands. She was coordinating investments. She oversaw cash movements into legitimate companies, construction firms, racehorse stables, and hotels that doubled as laundering fronts. She was, by all definitions, a financial operative. Her job was to make dirty money look like business. The outfit valued loyalty, but it also rewarded efficiency. Hill made them money. She was promoted without ceremony. Her new task was to oversee the West Coast Clearinghouse, a financial hub created to stabilize betting revenues that were being funneled through California. It was there she encountered the next level of organized crime's evolution, the merging of Chicago's outfit with the National Crime Syndicate, a cooperative led by Charles Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. Epstein, ever pragmatic, introduced her to the network through ledgers and telegrams before she met any of the men in person. She learned the names that mattered: Frank Costello, the prime minister of the mob; Albert Anastasia, who managed enforcement; and Lansky, who controlled the financial structure. These men were businessmen first, killers second. They were building a system that could survive public outrage and congressional hearings. The syndicate needed people who could bridge cities, who could move undetectable money from coast to coast. Hill became one of them. She began traveling regularly between Chicago and Los Angeles, carrying coded instructions from Epstein to the West Coast bookmaking operations run by Jack Dragner and Mickey Cohen. The job required more than delivery, it required diplomacy. She negotiated profit percentages, mediated disputes, and made sure everyone's numbers matched. Epstein called her "my little commissioner." The FBI didn't miss her movements. Reports from 1937 and 1938 list a female courier believed to be handling confidential financial matters for Epstein. Hoover's men followed her to hotels, cafes, and train stations, but she stayed one step ahead. Her charm worked as camouflage. Agents wrote she was outspoken but evasive, a woman of exceptional intelligence who never says more than she intends to. That was intentional. Hill understood that every question was a test. Her silence became legend. When Epstein sent her west permanently in 1938, it wasn't just a promotion. It was a test of trust. Her assignment was to stabilize the outfit's Los Angeles revenues and open a new line between the studios and the syndicate. Hollywood had become a gambler's paradise, and the outfit wanted its share. Her introduction to the local network went through Mickey Cohen, a boxer turned bookmaker who ruled LA's underworld under the supervision of Chicago. Through Cohen, she met the men who ran the city's high-end casinos and backroom poker clubs, and more importantly, the stars and producers who bankrolled them. Within months, Hill was moving in circles that blurred into one another, celebrities, gangsters, and politicians who spent the same money in different rooms. She was still Epstein's agent, but her independence grew. She no longer needed permission to make deals. She had learned enough to operate on instinct. Her connections expanded to include men like George Raft, the film star who brokered introductions between gangsters and Hollywood executives, and Johnny Roselli, the outfit's liaison to the studios. She handled their payouts discreetly and attended their parties as if she belonged. She did belong. By 1939, she was managing hundreds of thousands of dollars in West Coast betting profits. She owned jewelry worth more than her childhood home, sent her mother a steady allowance, and paid income taxes under her real name. The Bureau, suspecting fraud, launched a financial investigation. It led nowhere. Her accounts were clean, the money untraceable. She had become what Epstein designed her to be, a financial ghost. In later years, when reporters tried to label her as a gangster's mistress, they missed the truth. Hill was never a bystander. She was one of the first civilians to understand how organized crime became organized finance, the blueprint for everything that followed. She had been Epstein's student, and she surpassed him. She could now read the underworld like a balance sheet. And when Epstein's old associate Benjamin Siegel began building his empire out west, she was ready. Their paths would cross at exactly the moment when Las Vegas turned from desert to dynasty, and when her knowledge, her records, and her memory became the most dangerous possession in America. By the time Virginia Hill arrived in California in 1938, the Chicago outfit already owned half the city. They just hadn't filed the paperwork. Bookmakers worked out of barbershops. Nightclubs doubled as counting rooms. Police raids were scheduled, not spontaneous. What the organization needed was someone who could make the operation look respectable. That was why Joe Epstein had sent her. Hill took a suite at the Beverly Wilshire and registered as a consultant. She wasn't lying. Her job was to consult on the flow of money, to oversee how Chicago's investments in Los Angeles were disguised, spent, and reabsorbed. Her contacts on arrival were Mickey Cohen and Jack Dragner, the outfit's Western coordinators. Cohen controlled the bookmakers, Dragner the muscle. Both reported directly to Frank Nitti in Chicago. Hill met Cohen first. He was loud, brash, and street-born, the opposite of Epstein's polished professionalism. But he understood her importance. "You're the one that counts," he told her. It was a compliment and a warning. She inspected the city like an auditor, visiting racetracks, nightclubs, and gambling parlors. Most were profitable, none were efficient. Money disappeared between tables and accounts. She fixed that. She installed a new reporting structure. Percentages were logged, expenses justified, and skim-tracked. It wasn't about morality, it was about control. Hill's first major move was to open a bank account under her real name at the Bank of America branch on Wilshire Boulevard, a signal to everyone watching that she was operating in the open. It worked. Los Angeles society accepted her as another ambitious newcomer with money to spend. Within a year, she was seen at the Trocadero, the Brown Derby, and the Mocambo, the nightclubs where movie stars and mobsters drank side by side. To the press, she was a glamorous Southern heiress. To the FBI, she was a suspected courier for Chicago syndicate interests. To the men who actually paid her, she was the accountant who made their money invisible. Hollywood in the late 30s was built on appearance. The studios sold dreams, but their profits came from gambling, liquor, and political protection. Hill understood that system instantly. She courted producers, directors, and stars, learning who owed money to bookies and who could be pressured. She became a familiar face in the right booths and at the right parties, the woman who knew which actors bet too much and which studio heads financed them. Her neutrality made her valuable. She wasn't seen as part of any one gang. She worked for everyone who needed discretion. Dragner used her to move cash between Hollywood and San Francisco. Cohen used her to pay off police. Even legitimate businessmen hired her to channel money into real estate. Her commissions were substantial. Behind the surface glamour, she was still writing things down. Coded notes, initials, arrows. The same system Epstein had taught her now mapped an entire city's underground economy. What she held in those pages wasn't gossip, it was power. In 1940, the government began paying attention to more than gambling. The United States was inching toward war, and federal agencies quietly tracked the flow of money between America's crime syndicates and European financial networks. Hill's name began to appear in reports not only from the FBI, but from the Treasury Department's Bureau of Narcotics and the newly formed Office of Naval Intelligence. No one accused her of espionage, but she was observed meeting foreign nationals, businessmen from Italy and Switzerland, connected to both banking and film distribution. Some investigators later speculated she acted as a conduit for information between organized crime and wartime intelligence. Nothing was proven, but her freedom of movement across borders during the early 1940s was remarkable. Her social profile grew alongside the suspicion. She was photographed with movie stars like George Raft and with producers who owed money to bookmakers. Reporters described her as a woman with too many friends and too few explanations. Behind the scenes, she managed the outfit's Western wire room, a network of telephones and bookkeepers that coordinated bets across 6 states. Every call was technically illegal, every profit carefully laundered through legitimate fronts. When Prohibition ended, the syndicates didn't vanish, they diversified. Hill helped them do it. She was at the center of the shift from bootlegging to banking, from violence to investment. The mob was learning how to operate in daylight, and she was the bridge. By 1943, she was on file with both the FBI and the IRS. Hoover's office labeled her uncooperative, evasive, highly intelligent. The IRS calculated her unreported income and placed her on its most wanted list. Neither agency could touch her. Every paper trail ended with someone else's signature. The FBI didn't know it yet, but they were already chasing the woman who would one day hold the most dangerous diary in American crime history. For now, they only knew her as Virginia Hill, the spy in silk, beautiful, untouchable, and one move ahead of everyone watching. It was around this time that Virginia met Benjamin Siegel. What Bugsy found was a woman who matched his arrogance with calculation. Someone who could look at him. A man who killed without hesitation and not flinch. Their first meeting took place at a Hollywood party in 1941. Siegel was already a myth in motion, handsome, impeccably dressed, and known for violence so sudden that even his allies feared him. Hill was standing at the edge of the room watching. They were introduced by actor George Raft, a movie gangster who modeled his performances on real ones. The chemistry was immediate, but it wasn't romantic in the ordinary sense. Siegel saw utility. Hill was connected to Chicago's financial network and had direct access to Joe Epstein's money lines. She saw the same in him, a man positioned between Lansky's East Coast syndicate and the Hollywood elite she had been cultivating. Their alliance began as business. Within weeks, it became something else, volatile, intense, and mutually exploitative. Siegel moved into Hill's orbit completely. She handled his cash transfers, advised him on investments, and occasionally hid money in her own accounts when his spending drew attention. The IRS, already tracking her for undeclared income, noted the surge. Between 1941 and 1943, she deposited over $200,000, a staggering sum for a woman with no official employment. Siegel didn't care. He treated money as proof of power and spent it with theatrical defiance, cars, jewelry, and imported furniture. Hill kept the numbers straight and the receipts hidden. The FBI began recording their movements. In internal memos, she was described as constant companion and financial associate of Benjamin Siegel, a leading figure in national syndicate activity. Wiretaps picked up fragments of arguments that confirmed their partnership was both personal and professional. They lived between Beverly Hills and Sunset Boulevard, alternating between luxury and chaos. The violence that made Siegel famous was always close. Neighbors reported shouting, broken glass, and sometimes gunfire. Then silence. Then the sound of laughter. Their fights were as extreme as their reconciliations. But beneath the turbulence, they were building something. In 1945, with the war ending, Siegel turned his attention east of Los Angeles, to the Nevada desert. The idea wasn't new. Build a casino hotel that could rival anything in Monte Carlo, a place where organized crime could launder its past under neon lights. Siegel called it the Flamingo. Hill was central from the start. She helped structure the finances through Epstein's network, channeling outfit funds into the project under legitimate fronts. She set up intermediary accounts, coordinated wire transfers, and recorded the transactions in her private shorthand, red for inflow, green for outflow. Officially, the investors were Chicago and New York mob figures. Unofficially, much of the bookkeeping passed through Hill's hands. Her notes from 1945 listed payments to construction companies, suppliers, and consultants, some of whom existed only on paper. The sums were enormous. The project should have made them untouchable. Instead, it exposed them. Costs spiraled. Siegel demanded imported materials, architectural redesigns, and amenities that turned the original $1 million budget into $6 million. The syndicate leaders, Lansky, Costello, and Luciano's representatives, grew suspicious. They believed Siegel was skimming. Whether he did or not remains disputed, but Hill's role became pivotal. She defended him, insisted she'd seen the ledgers herself, and that every dollar was accounted for. The mob didn't believe her. The Flamingo opened on December 26, 1946, in a rainstorm. The lights failed, the crowd stayed home, and within days the casino was losing thousands. Siegel's charm no longer mattered. His partners wanted results or repayment. Virginia was there for all of it. She kept the books, calmed him when he raged, and tried to salvage the operation. For her, failure was more than financial. It was personal. The Flamingo had been their monument, proof that they could turn crime into empire. But the empire was bleeding. In early 1947, Hill sensed danger. She booked passage to Europe, officially for business, but she was running. She took with her cash, jewelry, and a set of documents she never discussed, her copies of the ledgers. She claimed she went ahead to open accounts in Switzerland. Siegel was supposed to join her later. He never did. On the night of June 20th, 1947, Benjamin Siegel sat on a sofa in Hill's Beverly Hills home reading the Los Angeles Times. Through the window, a rifle fired 9 shots. 2 hit him in the head. He died instantly. Within an hour, Lansky's men took control of the Flamingo. No one was arrested. The police called it a gangland slaying. The syndicate called it balance restored. Virginia Hill was in Paris when she heard. Witnesses said she collapsed. Others claimed she went silent for days. Either way, she understood what his death meant. The man who protected her was gone, and the men who paid them both believed she knew too much. When she returned to the United States later that year, she was summoned to testify before investigators probing the casino's finances. She denied everything, the money, the ledgers, even the affair. "I was just a friend," she told reporters. No one believed her. The FBI reopened her file, listing her as a subject of ongoing interest in relation to the Siegel murder and the Flamingo operation. But without evidence, they could only watch. Her survival became a kind of defiance. Most of Siegel's associates either died or disappeared. She remained, moving between Miami, New York, and Los Angeles, living on the margins of the empire she'd helped build. In the years that followed, her diary, the coded notebook she carried everywhere, became legend among agents and criminals alike. It was rumored to contain the full accounting of the Flamingo's construction, every payment and payoff, and perhaps the names of those who ordered Siegel's death. No one ever proved it, but everyone believed it. For the first time in her life, Virginia Hill was truly alone, a woman without allies, in possession of a secret that could end them all. Benjamin Siegel's death should have been the end of a scandal. Instead, it opened a new one. The Flamingo Hotel, still unfinished and hemorrhaging money, became the scene of a forensic audit by men who did not use calculators. Within hours of the shooting, emissaries from Chicago and New York arrived in Las Vegas. They went through the books, line by line, not to understand the numbers, but to decide who had been lying. Every receipt traced back to one person, Virginia Hill. Her name appeared on expense accounts, invoices, and wire transfers totaling millions. To the syndicate, it meant only one thing. She had seen everything. Whether she was guilty of theft or simply the last person left holding Siegel's secrets no longer mattered. The men who had financed the Flamingo wanted certainty, not justice. The following morning, Lansky's West Coast Lieutenant, Gus Greenbaum, took control of the casino. The losses stopped almost immediately. The same dealers, the same customers, the same rooms. Only the accounting changed. The Flamingo turned profitable within weeks. For the mob, that was proof Siegel had been skimming. Hill's defense of him now made her suspect too. She returned from Europe to face questions from every direction, the police, the IRS, and the men who had once called her Flame. The press described her as the redhead who outlived the mob's most dangerous man. The FBI described her as a material witness and potential conspirator. Inside the bureau, Hoover demanded constant updates. He wanted to know if she had kept copies of Siegel's records. She had. Agents raided her Beverly Hills home on July 2, 1947. They found documents, letters, and a locked safe that had already been emptied. The search produced nothing usable in court, but confirmed what the Bureau suspected. Hill was still managing accounts tied to the Flamingo's original investors. The total discrepancy in the casino's construction costs was estimated at over $5 million, and she could account for every cent, except the $1 million that had vanished in the final months before Siegel's death. The mob concluded Siegel had taken it. Others believed Hill had hidden it abroad. Neither theory was provable. What was clear was that she had survived. Again. Hill moved between cities, changing hotels weekly. Surveillance reports placed her in Miami, Havana, and New York, often meeting men connected to the syndicate's banking network. She transferred funds through Swiss intermediaries and maintained contact with Joe Epstein, still overseeing Chicago's finances. When federal agents questioned Epstein about her, he called her a nice girl who's had bad luck with men. He refused to say more. The Bureau's frustration grew. In internal memoranda, agents complained that she evinced no fear and defied interrogation with charm and deflection. They could trace her movements, but never her money. In 1948, the IRS formally charged her with tax evasion, listing unreported income of $146,000. Hill laughed when served the warrant. "If you can find the money," she told reporters, "you can have it." Behind the sarcasm, she was cornered. Epstein's protection was fading. He was under investigation himself. Meyer Lansky, now consolidating the syndicate's international operations, wanted no attention. Mickey Cohen, the Los Angeles boss, warned her to stay quiet. Her only ally left was her own information. Hill began to travel frequently to Mexico and Europe, sometimes carrying nothing but a briefcase. Agents speculated she was moving Siegel's hidden funds, laundering them through foreign accounts. They tracked her to Zurich, where she opened an account under an alias linked to a hotel chain later identified as a front for syndicate investments. The deposit, exactly $1 million. Whether the money was Siegel's missing fortune or her own payoff for silence has never been proven. What is certain is that her financial independence made her untouchable. Men who wanted her gone hesitated. Killing her would invite questions about the very secrets they wanted buried. In 1950, her luck ran out, not from the mob, but from Washington. The Kefauver Committee, investigating organized crime in America, subpoenaed her to testify. She tried to avoid it, fleeing to Mexico City. U.S. Marshals escorted her back in handcuffs. The woman who once carried millions for the mob now faced the cameras as a federal witness. When she entered the Senate hearing room, photographers shouted her name. She wore a black suit, pearls, and the faintest smile. The senators expected contrition. They got performance. "Do you deny knowing Benjamin Siegel?" "I don't deny knowing anyone," she said. "Were you aware of his illegal activities?" If he had any, he never discussed them over breakfast. Laughter filled the room. The hearing was broadcast live. Millions watched as the committee tried and failed to corner her. Every question met with sarcasm, every accusation with disinterest. The chairman, Senator Estes Kefauver, finally asked, "Miss Hill, what is it you do for a living?" "I get along," she replied. The line made headlines across the country. For the FBI, it was infuriating. For the mob, it was confirmation that she would never talk. For the public, it was entertainment. Once again, Virginia Hill had turned survival into spectacle. After the hearings, she disappeared from public view. The Bureau maintained surveillance until 1952, then closed her domestic file, noting, "Subject appears to have relocated overseas." What they didn't record was that she left the United States on an Italian freighter under her married name, carrying with her the last remnants of Siegel's empire, and the diary that catalogued it. The Flamingo continued to thrive, its origins sanitized by time. Tourists gambled beneath chandeliers paid for with stolen money, unaware that the woman who once balanced its books was now living quietly in Europe, watched by men on both sides of the law. The blood on the Flamingo had long been washed away, but the stain followed her wherever she went. To some, she was a thief. To others, a survivor. To the FBI, she remained a question mark. The woman who had seen the beginning and end of an empire and walked out alive. But history has a price, and silence was hers. The men she had outlived were gone, but the memories she carried and the records she'd kept still held value. She was no longer the mob's courier. She was its archive, and archives in the underworld never stay safe for long. When the cameras stopped flashing, the senators had their headlines, but Virginia Hill had her victory. She had walked into Congress accused of being a mob accountant and walked out a celebrity. The Kefauver hearings made her a household name, the redhead who mocked Washington on live television and left the committee speechless. For most witnesses, public humiliation ended their careers. For Hill, it confirmed her legend. But the cost was high. The men who had once protected her were finished. Joe Epstein was under federal audit. Mickey Cohen was in prison. Meyer Lansky was retreating into offshore finance, increasingly wary of Hill's visibility. She was, as one FBI memo phrased it, a free agent in a world where freedom is a liability. After the hearings, Hill lived in constant motion. She moved from California to New York, then to Miami. Each city followed the same pattern: a brief apartment lease, a few weeks of social appearances, then sudden departure. She traveled under her own name but used multiple passports. The Bureau reopened her file under the classification "potential witness with unresolved international financial interests." Her movements didn't fit the profile of a fugitive. She wasn't hiding. she was operating. In 1951, she resurfaced in Mexico City, living in a villa registered to a shell company tied to a Chicago construction firm. That firm, investigators later discovered, was part of a network Lansky used to funnel US money into Cuban casinos. Whether Hill managed those accounts herself or acted as an intermediary was never proven, but wire transfers from Mexico to Havana bore her signature. Her name began appearing in Treasury Department memoranda, alongside words like foreign investment and unverified deposits. The Bureau of Narcotics, already tracking Lansky's banking interests, listed her as probable courier for laundering of syndicate proceeds into European institutions. In plain terms, she was moving money again, but she was no longer working just for gangsters. The post-war world was shifting. Intelligence agencies, the newly formed CIA among them, had learned that the same routes used by criminals for smuggling and finance could also be used for covert funding. Several of Hill's former contacts, especially those who had managed pre-war financial traffic between the US and Italy, now worked for these agencies in unofficial capacities. Her name appeared in their correspondence, never as an employee, but as a trusted intermediary. It made sense. She spoke fluent English, passable Italian, and could cross borders without attracting attention. She knew how to move cash discreetly, and she owed loyalty to no one. By 1953, she had relocated to Rome. To the world, she was a socialite with connections to both Hollywood and the American Embassy. To the FBI, she was a missing person of interest. To the CIA, she was useful, an independent contractor with a network that spanned Europe and the Americas. Her income, once the product of gambling circuits, now came from consulting fees paid by holding companies that existed only on paper. Investigators tracing those companies found links to the Banco di Napoli and several Swiss institutions later identified as conduits for covert post-war operations. The amounts were small by mob standards, tens of thousands, but steady. Hill had reinvented herself yet again, from gangster's courier to global financial intermediary. The Bureau didn't buy it. In 1955, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago reactivated her tax case. Agents intercepted her letters from Rome and Zurich, documenting her communications with Epstein and Lansky's men. When subpoenaed, she refused to appear. When threatened with extradition, she hired lawyers connected to both the Italian Christian Democrats and the American consulate. The case collapsed quietly the following year. Still, the scrutiny followed her. European newspapers published photos of her leaving embassies, attending charity events, and dining with businessmen under investigation for currency violations. The woman who had once been a tabloid villain was now an enigma, a symbol of how deeply the American underworld had blended with post-war diplomacy. Privately, Hill began writing again. Her notebooks, once purely financial, now included names of officials, account numbers, and coded remarks about agreements and protection. Some who later saw fragments claim she documented not only mob transactions, but intelligence-linked payments made during the early Cold War. If true, her diary no longer exposed just criminals. It exposed governments. By the late 1950s, she was in Vienna. She lived modestly, renting a flat under the name Mrs. Virginia Hauser. The man she introduced as her husband, Hans Hauser, was an Austrian ski instructor 20 years her junior. They married in 1959. For the first time, Virginia Hill seemed settled. The world thought she had disappeared, but her file never closed. The FBI's Vienna attaché sent periodic updates to Washington. They noted that Hill maintains contact with former organized crime figures now residing in Italy and Switzerland. The reports grew sparse after 1960, but the surveillance didn't stop. She had become, without realizing it, part of a larger pattern, one of hundreds of Cold War exiles whose lives straddled criminal enterprise and political utility. When Joe Epstein died in 1958, Hill inherited nothing but fear. He left no records, no explanation, and no protection. What he did leave, according to private notes seized years later, was a message. If she still has the book, tell her to burn it. She didn't. The diary stayed with her, a ledger that had evolved into something far more dangerous than the Flamingo's accounts. It contained 20 years of names, codes, and payoffs, from gangsters to government men. She kept it locked, moved it from apartment to apartment, and never spoke of it again. For the next 6 years, Virginia Hill lived quietly in Austria, raising her son, tending her garden, and receiving occasional visitors from Italy and America. To her neighbors, she was polite and reserved, but her quiet life was an illusion. The files in Washington still carried her name, updated with new classifications: former organized crime associate, possible international asset, watch only. The State Department knew where she lived. The Bureau's liaison in Vienna sent annual status reports noting that she maintains contact with known underworld figures under investigation for currency violations. No one ever officially reopened her case, but no one stopped watching her either. It was in those years that the diary resurfaced. She kept it hidden in her home in Salzburg and, according to later testimony, sent duplicate pages to a bank in Switzerland. She called it "My Record of Debts." It listed who owed whom and what silence had cost. The FBI never got the original, but agents who reviewed fragments of her correspondence in 1965 reported references to an ongoing financial record maintained by subject, possibly for leverage purposes. That phrase, leverage purposes, appeared back in classified memoranda from both the Treasury Department and the CIA. The agencies weren't working together, but they were looking at the same problem. A woman who once carried the mob's money still held its paper trail. The old network began to reappear around her. In 1964, she met in Vienna with a former American banker under investigation for illegal foreign transfers. Weeks later, she was seen dining with an Italian businessman tied to Lansky's operations in Naples. The Austrian security police logged both meetings, noting, "The woman appears nervous but cautious." What she was doing was unclear. Some thought she was attempting to reclaim money still owed to her from the Flamingo project. Others believed she was selling information, pieces of her diary, to intermediaries who wanted to sanitize the record before it reached investigators. Whatever the truth, one fact stood out. Virginia Hill had begun to run out of allies. Her old friends were gone. Epstein was dead. Lansky's empire was under pressure. The CIA, which had once found her network convenient, no longer needed her. She was an aging woman carrying secrets that belonged to powerful men in 2 countries. In 1965, she traveled briefly to Italy, meeting with a Swiss attorney connected to offshore holdings once tied to Siegel and Epstein. The lawyer died a few weeks later in what was officially ruled a robbery. Austrian intelligence privately called it a possible cleanup. When she returned to Salzburg, she told friends she was done with the past. She sold jewelry, paid off small debts, and spoke often of wanting peace. But peace was never an option for her. The surveillance resumed. Her phone was tapped by Austrian authorities at the request of a foreign agency. Reports noted frequent calls to Rome and Zurich, and occasional contact with persons of interest to American law enforcement. The Austrian officers never said who requested the tap, but the order came directly from Vienna, a level above normal police procedure. She began acting differently. Friends later recalled that she seemed watchful, checking her mail carefully, sometimes burning papers in her garden. She told one neighbor, "They still think I have it." She was right. The men who had built their empires on the money she once carried still feared that book. She paid off her remaining bills, mailed a few letters, and made one final trip to the post office. One of those letters went to Chicago, addressed to an associate of Joe Epstein. Inside was a small key and a note written in her careful handwriting, "In case of emergency or my death." The key belonged to a safe deposit box. She was last seen alive on March 23, 1966. The next morning, her car was found on a snow-covered road near the village of Koppel. The police arrived quickly. They found a bottle of sleeping pills, a handwritten note, and an undisturbed field of snow. The note said, "I am tired of life." But the handwriting was hesitant, a mix of cursive and block letters that didn't match her usual style. The local authorities treated it as suicide. Within 48 hours, American officials from the US Embassy in Vienna arrived and requested access to her effects for consular purposes. The Austrians complied. The notebook, the briefcase, and several letters were taken to Vienna. They were never returned. Those who saw the diary before it vanished described it not as gossip, but as evidence. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, half financial record, half confession, filled with 2 decades of transactions written in Hill's distinct slanted hand. Each page was color-coded: red ink for money received, green for money moved, black for legitimate expenses. Investigators who briefly handled the book said it connected organized crime accounts to legitimate American corporations, banks, and political figures. There were entries linking Las Vegas construction firms, Miami real estate companies, and New York shipping interests that had laundered mob gambling profits into respectable business fronts. One section, labeled simply F, detailed the full financing of the Flamingo, 9 large wire transfers from Chicago and New York between 1945 and 1946, totaling over $4 million. Each transaction was annotated in Hill's shorthand, OK, ML, and handled JE, almost certainly Meyer Lansky and Joe Epstein. The later pages shifted tone. Under headings like Protection Rome and Retainer Zurich, she recorded post-war payments to foreign bankers, import-export brokers, and at least 2 American lawyers known to have handled reconstruction funds. Austrian officers who photographed a few pages before surrendering them noted that several of the names matched public officials active in Italy and Switzerland during the early Cold War. Even more disturbing were pages titled Government. Under that single word appeared a list of initials corresponding to US and European officials tied to wartime intelligence and finance. Besides some, she had written brief remarks: transit OK, funds merged, see Swiss Act. To investigators, the meaning was unmistakable. The black money of organized crime, cash from gambling, smuggling, and wartime rackets, had been folded into legitimate post-war financial systems, protected by the same institutions sworn to fight corruption. The handwriting was unquestionably hers. She underlined totals twice and placed dollar signs after the amount, an odd personal habit noted in her earlier FBI-seized notebooks. When those pages disappeared into diplomatic custody, they erased more than a document. They erased the last tangible record of how the underworld became the understructure of modern finance. Virginia Hill had once balanced the mob's books. Now, with her death, the balance had been restored to everyone except history. The Austrian police report on Virginia Hill's death was a model of efficiency. 6 pages long, signed, stamped, and filed within a week. It contained little more than a date, a location, and a cause: suicide by overdose. No photographs of the scene were made public. No autopsy transcript appeared in the record. The only witness listed was the farmer who discovered her car. There was no mention of the missing diary, or of the American officials who arrived within 48 hours to claim her belongings. To the local authorities, the case was closed before it began. But inside the Interior Ministry, a second document circulated privately, one marked vertraulich, confidential. It confirmed that representatives of the United States Embassy in Vienna had removed personal effects and papers of significance from the deceased before Austrian investigators had completed their examination. The file made no reference to the item's contents and offered no explanation for their transfer. A week later, the embassy sent a short cable to Washington. Subject Hill, Virginia. Deceased. Effects received. Matter closed. It was the last official acknowledgement that she had ever existed. Not everyone in Salzburg believed the story. The officers who first reached the scene noted inconsistencies that didn't fit the suicide narrative. The car doors were locked from the outside. The paper used for the note came from a Salzburg hotel Hill hadn't visited in months. The dosage of barbiturates in her bloodstream was too low to be fatal on its own, but there were traces of another sedative not prescribed to her. If it was suicide, one detective told a reporter years later, it was a perfectly organized one. When he tried to reopen the file, the order came down from Vienna. No further inquiry. Within weeks, the photographs from the scene and the negatives of the diary pages had vanished from the evidence room. In Washington, her case was quietly reclassified. The FBI transferred her file from the Organized Crime Division to a restricted cabinet under Intelligence Liaison. Only 3 people inside the bureau retained clearance to view it. J. Edgar Hoover himself signed the transfer slip, adding 3 words in the margin: "No further dissemination." The CIA's archives later filled in what the bureau chose not to explain. A memorandum dated April 1967 referred to financial documentation retrieved from deceased U.S. national in Austria, sensitive pre- and post-war material. The date and description matched Hill's death exactly. Her diary hadn't disappeared, it had been absorbed. For the underworld, her death settled an old debt. Lansky was in Israel, Costello retired, Cohen back in prison. None of them spoke her name. Eliminating her removed a potential witness who knew where the money had gone and how it had been cleaned. But for Washington, the disappearance of her papers served another purpose. By the mid-1960s, several of the same offshore banks used by the syndicate in the 1940s had become conduits for covert intelligence funding in Europe and Latin America. If Hill's diary traced those accounts back to their origins, it linked organized crime's profits to the same financial networks later used in Cold War operations. Her silence, voluntary or not, protected both sides. Her husband, Hans Hauser, offered the simplest version of events. "My wife was depressed about money," he told the police. That single sentence was enough for the coroner to close the file. Hauser left Austria within weeks and was never heard from again. The funeral was small: 2 Austrian policemen, a priest, and a wreath sent by the American embassy. The official death certificate listed her occupation as housewife. Hoover's final summary of her life, typed on a half sheet of bureau stationery, was 34 words long. Hill, Virginia. Female, born Alabama, 1916. Former associate of Benjamin Siegel and Joseph Epstein. No current significance. Deceased, Salzburg, March 24, 1966. It was bureaucratic precision masquerading as history. Years later, an Austrian journalist named Kurt Haldenwang tried to revisit the case. One of the detectives who had handled the original investigation told him off the record that there was American pressure to close the file quickly. The detective said he had once seen photographs of the diary pages, bank names, politicians, coded initials, but when he attempted to retrieve the negatives, the archive drawer was empty. "Foreign request," his superior had said. "Case sealed." Haldenwang published what he could, but no one in Vienna wanted to touch the story. The Cold War was still on, and the United States was still Austria's most powerful ally. By then, Virginia Hill had been reduced to a footnote, the gangster's mistress who drank too much and died abroad. The tabloids remembered her red hair, the FBI remembered her file number. But the truth was far less romantic. She had kept records that connected 2 worlds the public was never supposed to see together. The underworld that laundered its money through casinos and banks, and the government agencies that later used those same channels for secret wars. Her death had erased both the evidence and the witness. The woman who once balanced the mob's books had taken the measure of far greater accounts. In the end, she was neither the criminal they portrayed nor the victim they dismissed. She was the missing line in a ledger no one wanted found, the proof that crime and power had shared the same accountant. But the past has a way of resurfacing. In 1975, a congressional review of FBI activities unearthed a list of archived sensitive cases that included her name. The entry was brief: Hill, Virginia, deceased, material of financial intelligence relevance retained under separate cover. The file itself was gone. The notation proved that the Bureau still knew exactly where her papers were, even as it denied their existence. Around the same time, a retired Treasury agent told journalist Hank Messick that he had once seen photostats of Hill's notebook in an interagency briefing binder used for organized crime and covert finance coordination. According to him, the pages contained names of banks and companies later connected to both mob investments and government operations overseas. After that interview, Messick's requests for access to the documents were rejected on national security grounds. By the 1980s, Hill's story was being rewritten again, this time by Hollywood. She was transformed from a sharp financial operative into a doomed romantic, a red-headed gangster's moll who died of heartbreak. It was the same reduction the mob and the government had relied on for decades: erase the intelligence, keep the spectacle. The movies left out the ledgers, the foreign accounts, and the embassy that claimed her papers. They left out the part where her silence protected both sides of the same empire. When declassification began in the 1990s, fragments of her trail reappeared. An Austrian diplomatic log confirmed that documents of potential American sensitivity had been transferred to US custody in April 1966. A CIA file, released by mistake under a general Freedom of Information request, referred to post-war monetary intelligence sources formerly associated with organized criminal finance. The date, again, matched her death. Someone inside the agency had tagged her as a source, not a suspect. Even in death, she was still considered useful. Journalists who tried to reopen her case met silence. The FBI denied holding her diary. The Treasury Department claimed no record of her accounts. The CIA offered a single sentence: "We have no information responsive to your request." In the language of bureaucracy, that phrase doesn't mean the information doesn't exist. It means you can't have it. By then, the world her diary described had evolved into the mainstream. The casinos she helped fund were corporations traded on the stock exchange. The same banks that once washed syndicate cash now financed global investments. What had once been criminal was now infrastructure. Hill's work, invisible and unacknowledged, had become the blueprint of a system that cleaned money, not with fear, but with paperwork. In 2003, the Austrian journalist Kurt Haldenwang, then in his 80s, published his final interview about the case. He said he had spoken to one of the original investigators who handled Hill's belongings before the Americans arrived. That man, long retired, claimed the ledger was the most dangerous document he had ever seen, not because of what it said about the mob, but because of what it revealed about respectability. It showed that the difference between crime and business was bookkeeping, he said. That's why they had to make her disappear. Today, Virginia Hill exists in two versions. In the official record, she is a minor character in the story of Benjamin Siegel, an accessory to a myth. In the suppressed version, she is the connective tissue between organized crime and organized power. The courier who became the accountant who became the witness, and the witness who was erased. Her death in Austria was not an ending, it was a redaction. If the missing diary ever resurfaces, it will not simply rewrite her life, it will rewrite the history of post-war America. It will show that beneath the glitter of Las Vegas and the respectability of American finance lies the same flow of cash she once carried in a purse, counted in train compartments, and recorded in colored ink. For now, all that remains are fragments, an entry in a diplomatic log, a line in an intelligence memo, a footnote in a congressional report. But the silence around those fragments speaks louder than any testimony. It is the silence that protects institutions, reputations, and legacies. It is the silence she died for. In the end, Virginia Hill's death solved more problems than it created. For organized crime, it erased the only woman who could trace where every dollar came from and where it went. For the government, it buried a trail of money that blurred the line between law enforcement and the underworld it claimed to fight. And for history, it offered an easy story. A beautiful woman who lived too fast, loved the wrong man and died alone. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. She didn't die for love. She died because she kept the books. And in a world built on money, the one who keeps the books always knows too much.